Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you here to our Miller Center discussion of China's Law of the Sea. My name is Aynne Kokas. I'm the C.K. Yen Chair here at the Miller Center, a professor of media studies and the director of our East Asia Center. I am particularly excited to welcome our two guests here because this is an area of intensive concern, not just for the areas of China studies or in the area of political science, but really an area of intensive concern and of interest and engagement for anyone who's following questions of global stability, particularly across the Taiwan Straits, though, as we'll learn today, it is not that at all, or not only that at all. So today our two guests are Dr. Isaac B. Kardon, a senior fellow for China Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is concurrently adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS and was formerly assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College, where he served as a research faculty member in the China Maritime Studies Institute. Kardon's research follows the People's Republic of China maritime power with a specialization in maritime disputes and the international law of the sea. Most notably, he is also the author of the recently published book from Yale University Press, China's Law of the Sea, which we will be discussing today and which is also on sale outside for after the event. I'm also particularly excited to welcome Dr. Kardon here because he's long been someone that I've learned about these issues from as part of a Wilson Center China Fellowship. And so he's long been an expert that many of us have looked toward, and I'm really excited to be able to welcome him down to Charlottesville from DC. Commander Delicia Gonzales Zimmerman is an associate professor in the National Security Law Department at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. She earned a BA in American Government and Politics from the University of Texas at Austin, a JD from Dedman School of Law at Southern Methodist University, and an MA in National Security Policy Studies at the U.S. Naval Law College. She has practiced as an attorney with the U.S. Navy since 2003. But perhaps one thing that I would like to share with you about Commander Zimmerman is when I was looking for someone to speak on this panel, I reached out to my wonderful colleague Mark Metcalf from the McIntyre School of Commerce, who was previously also a commander in the U.S. Navy, and he said, there is someone that you need to meet here on grounds who just arrived from Japan and this past September, and she is really the best person we have here to talk about this. So I feel really excited to welcome Commander Zimmerman as one of our new Charlottesville residents and also an expert in this incredibly important area. So it's really a pleasure to have you both here and to have you in conversation. We already started with a very lively conversation earlier, and I'm really excited to be able to share that with the rest of you now. So just to get started, Isaac, you wrote this tremendous book, China's Law of the Sea, which has already been an incredibly useful resource for me. And I was wondering if you could just share a little bit more about the key arguments of the book and what led you to write it.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me, first of all, Professor Kokas. It's really a treat to be here at UVA for the first time.
Oh, first time. Welcome. You'll have to come back.
That's right. And delightful to share the stage with Commander Zimmerman, who I just learned is a Naval War College grad, where I taught prior to coming down to DC. So Professor Kokas is right. It is a tremendous book. It weighs a pound and a half. It's got 50,000 words just of footnotes and bibliography. A lot of it bilingual, which adds to the word count. But hopefully the title captures more or less what the book is all about and why I wrote it. China's Law of the Sea, and the subtitle is The New Rules of Maritime Order, is basically about China's attempts to change the rules of international law in this particular domain. And by looking at maritime disputes, you can actually focus in on and isolate specific rules where China has an interpretation of it that's at odds with one or more other countries. This is sort of the predicate for having a dispute. And it's important to note that this is primarily not a US-China story. We're familiar with the controversy about freedom of navigation. That's sort of the core rule that's at stake in China's application of its law of the sea in comparison to, say, the American interpretation of the law of the sea. But the disputes are about sovereignty. The disputes are about resources. The disputes have a lot to do with domestic nationalism in a lot of the littoral countries, the neighboring countries. And so ultimately, most of the rules in question have to do with how do you draw boundaries and who gets to do what in which space. And that has put China at odds with each of its maritime neighbors. It bears noting, and one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book is that it's extraordinary that China has no settled maritime boundaries. There's one partially delimited boundary in the Gulf of Tonkin with Vietnam, a very small segment of their overall maritime dispute. But basically, this is from my perspective, is a really important site to observe China's relationship with international order, and in particular with some of the rules that are widely agreed to be constituent parts, at least, of that international order. And by being a little bit literal-minded about rules and really thinking about the law of the sea, specific rules that are written down in black ink in many languages in the largest treaty instrument under the United Nations system. It's the there are more states parties to it than anything but the UN Charter in the system. And so it's a good representation of something about whatever the rules-based international order is that is now so central to the American conception of its role in the world and of what the nature of the challenge is from China.
So one of the areas of commonality between my work and Dr. Kardon's work is this kind of fluidity of China's legal claim, or the fluidity of China's legal sovereignty, and the way in which that is often used to expand China's sovereign claims. I look at it in the context of digital sovereignty. Dr. Kardon looks at it in the context of maritime sovereignty, but in many ways it operates functionally in a very similar way. Now, this brings us to a question for Commander Zimmerman. What would you say that China is trying to accomplish through its maritime claims through the South and East China Sea? And to build on your experience recently coming back from operating in Japan, what did you see? How did you see that play out?
Well, first, I would like to thank the Miller Center for inviting me here. So I spend all day with the Army Judge Advocate Corps, where I teach them law of the sea. So it's kind of nice to be here and be able to talk about naval things with some people that are actually interested in learning about maritime. With that being said, yes, I'm in the Navy, but my comments are solely mine, and they are not to be endorsed or reflected upon the DoD or the Department of the Navy. However, with that being said, I have spent 20 years in the Navy, so my opinions are a reflection of that time in the Navy. What do I think China's trying to do down there? They're trying to establish control of the area. That's what they're doing with their claims. It is preventing people or different countries from being able to access those waters, namely the Philippines and some of the other coastal nations. I also think that they're trying to do that to keep the U.S. Navy out of those waters in anticipation of an eventual war over Taiwan. Right now, they are building the condition precedent for that war over there. With respect to Japan, we're seeing the same thing going on right now. Back in the beginning of January, the PRC announced that they're going to establish 365 days of presence in the Senkaku Islands, which is in the East China Sea, which is one of the disputed islands between China and Japan. They're going to start off with their Coast Guard, and they're going to try to prevent the Japanese Coast Guard from administering some type of control over there. Probably eventually, as time goes by, if they're able to keep Japan out for long enough, they'll probably try to develop one of those islands or one of those rocks into an island. Again, this is about control as much as sovereignty. I would say the one thing that China knows, which every squatter knows, is that physical possession is 9/10 of the law, right? So if they're there and they're doing it continuously, in the open and hostile to other countries' claims, eventually one day those rocks, which do have oil reserves underneath them, could be China's.
And one thing that this reminds me of is the really fascinating land reclamation projects that are happening around Hong Kong as well, which take these kind of very small uninhabited rocks, as you call them, and are turning them into spaces where there will be habitation and shopping and rail connections to Zhuhai, mainland China. So there's really, it's part of this kind of larger effort, it seems, to both expand maritime sovereignty, but also in some ways terrestrial sovereignty. Now, this brings us to this question of Taiwan. So we can't have a panel about China's law of the sea without talking about Taiwan. So just to both of you, how does China's approach to the law of the sea, or as Dr. Kardon terms it, China's law of the sea, shape potential conflict between Taiwan and the mainland?
So maybe I'll kind of chime in and continue the argument that Commander Zimmerman was making in thinking about control, and in particular control over maritime and airspace. It's worth noting that while there's a separate regime for airspace, it's the territorial sea boundary that defines where international airspace begins and national airspace ends. And so these are all closely knit together. And as the original title of the book that was a little bit too wonky was Rising Power, Creeping Jurisdiction. And I would actually describe that phenomenon as the process by which China wants to achieve greater control. Because you could say if you just want to achieve control over Taiwan, which is obviously a strategic objective for the Chinese Communist Party, going through this laborious, slow, gradual process of trying to change rules is certainly not the most direct way to do it. If seeking to control altogether from a military standpoint, to have sea control or air control over the South China Sea is the immediate object, they're not doing what we would do to accomplish that. What we see is the gradual creeping out of Chinese jurisdiction. And when we think about creeping jurisdiction, what I'm talking about is the idea that within the maritime and air space that China claims as being under its jurisdiction, they're finding new authorities under Chinese domestic code that's interpreting the law of the sea, if that's not too confusing. The idea is the law of in China, the prevailing idea is the law of the sea, this big treaty, is actually quite indeterminate and ambiguous in certain ways. And therefore, by putting into practice their version of the rules, that's under international law doctrine about customary international law, which is the prevailing theory in China. That's a way to change the circumstance and achieve slowly and gradually a level of control legitimized by law, at least Chinese domestic law. And so in the Taiwan Strait, we can take a look at some of these law of the sea issues and I think get a really interesting understanding of what China's strategy to date has been with respect to Taiwan. There has been de facto a median line that has been honored in terms of practice of Chinese, especially naval and air assets, for a very long time until the last several years. Now, this median line is not an agreed boundary, but it is something that's sort of part of the law of the sea way of interpreting, and it's sort of a common sense thing to do. If you have a dispute—
Dr. Kardon, I don't want to interrupt you, but could you explain a little bit further about median line?
Sure, yeah.
The median between what?
That's right. So the median between, say, coastal Taiwan and the coast of the mainland of China, exactly halfway in between had been this de facto median line on which side China was not operating any military vessels or aircraft, was not attempting to enforce its domestic law. And what we've seen, rather than a Ukraine-like or a Putin-like invasion of Ukraine in this case, is a slow and deliberate process of effacing the median line. It's now no longer normal. It's no longer the way that China practices. It distresses Taiwan. It distresses the United States. But because these are just marginal changes to include to the airspace, there's a lower escalatory pressure. And there's a very high presence of non-naval and non-military assets that are involved in this too. Again, a reflection of a much more kind of patient and slow-moving strategy to exert Chinese jurisdiction, control, authorized under law, over a wider range of things, whether it's fisheries, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's navigation. These are all areas that they're sort of reading in additional rights to regulate activity. Curious if that comports with your understanding of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's definitely gradual, right? So you can't just turn a rock into an island overnight. So they've been planning this for a while. And so as we look to how they interact with Taiwan, the thing that of note is last year they did an exercise. And what they did is they did a notice to airmen. And they said, look, they drew a box and they said, we're going to engage in dangerous military activity. If you fly into this box, beware. That box happened to overlap with Taipei's, one of their major air pairs. And so the interesting thing is, they effectively shut it down for a few hours. And so this is just a prelude of what could happen, right? So if China was really interested in invading Taiwan, they're going to do a blockade. They're going to do a naval blockade. And they're also going to establish air control. And so these are little things, right? Just little things that they're doing, but consistently to erode Taiwanese sovereignty, if we can even call that. Our relationship with Taiwan is obviously complicated, right? We believe or we adhere to the one China policy. But right now, Taiwan has their own government. So Taiwan is complicated when we're talking about international law. And there's a reason why we've always adhered to strategic ambiguity. It's because it's complicated. And so eventually, right, the hope would be one day, if Taiwan so chooses, they will be a part of China, right? But they have to choose that. And what the U.S. policy is we don't agree with any kind of unilateral taking of Taiwan.
So I noticed that neither of you mentioned the recent Taiwan elections, and that's fair because we are talking more explicitly about the law of the sea and how that plays out. And both of you also noted this kind of creeping or eroding pattern that we see from the legal perspective and also from a trade perspective in China's relationship with Taiwan. Do you see the election making significant changes? Even, we did see some continuity there of policy and of party, but did you see any potential changes as it relates to your areas of specificity?
So, just to continue on the previous comment about how China's putting into practice a system that basically gradually encircles Taiwanese maritime and airspace. This is part of a long-term program, as I said, and it requires a lot of capital-intensive development of things like a gigantic Coast Guard that fields some 12,000-ton ships bigger than U.S. Navy destroyers and a very large fleet of other maritime law enforcement vessels that could be involved. And when you have what they would interpret as adverse events in Taiwan, so for those not familiar, just very briefly, the incumbent party, the DPP, won its third consecutive election at the national level, and that is a party that has as its sort of core political principle an idea of Taiwanese identity and none of the attachment to the mainland that their primary party opponent, the Nationalist Party, the former government of the Republic of China, has. So this dismays Beijing. This is a step in the wrong direction from their standpoint of seeking to achieve unification with Taiwan. And so what I would expect, and I believe we're probably already seeing some indication that these are underway, is that this is a gradual process. They have not achieved sea and air control, or certainly not any recognized jurisdiction over a lot of this non-sovereign air and sea space, because they don't recognize Taiwanese sovereignty, of course. And so it's important to note, from China's perspective, the whole Taiwan Strait is a Chinese exclusive economic zone. And so I'm watching how they've described this on paper, as well as how they're doing it in practice. And what you see is a lag between what happens on paper and how they implement things in practice. But if you read China's Law of the Sea, not just the book, but what that stands in for, China's...
Oh, you should read the book.
That's right. China's policy and practice with respect to the Law of the Sea, you'll see that there have been a number of times where they've just sort of ratcheted up the level of what people often described as assertiveness, but that I would actually code as basically coming closer to the ideal that they've set out of exercising complete jurisdiction over all the waters that are under their jurisdiction. And that's a circular sentence because that's the way they conceived it too. One of the sources that I cite in this book and takes up some footnotes is the Supreme People's Court in China, the highest court in that system, was asked to interpret for the Chinese Coast Guard some of the scope of its responsibilities, and they dutifully listed off all the Law of the Sea zones that China does recognize, the internal waters, the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, continental shelf, and other waters under Chinese jurisdiction. Under the Law of the Sea, that's supposed to be exhaustive. Could have arguments on the margins of that about this concept of historic rights, which I'll leave aside. It's a little wonky, but I think that we should expect, because Beijing sees this as an adverse trend, that they'll probably accelerate some of these efforts. And we've been watching, bears noting, the gradual erosion and effacement of the median line of respect for Taiwan's contiguous zone, which doesn't have a ton of meaning in this context other than the symbolism of them creeping into different zones and normalizing the practice, not going all the way to Kiev as we've seen in Europe, but being extremely, extremely conservative in some ways about how much risk they're willing to take at each juncture.
And just as a quick note, if you're interested in these relationships between Taiwan and Ukraine, we do have an event on Tuesday at 3 p.m. that discusses the Ukraine war at 2 years. But I'd like to move back to Commander Zimmerman to see what you'd like to pick up on that thread.
No, I mean, we're seeing it right now. I believe China just did another military exercise, and what they're doing is every time they do a military exercise, they surround Taiwan. And so it looks like they're practicing an invasion, right? And that was clearly meant to send a message. Again, getting back to strategic ambiguity. And with respect to China and Taiwan, I think it's hard or difficult for Western societies to accept ambiguity. We like to know exactly what's going to happen, and we want everything written down. It's actually not a big deal, and it's actually a pretty good policy when it comes to Taiwan. China has to believe that one day they will be reunited with Taiwan. Mei Zedong said it doesn't matter, it could take 100 years, right? Taiwan will be a part of China. And when that opportunity or that window looks like it's going to be foreclosed, is there a potential that it could heighten up tensions? Could it potentially lead to war? Maybe. And so when we or other countries take actions that looks like we're going to foreclose that door for China, I can understand why they are going to turn up the heat, if you will. So yes, that's what we're seeing out there, is they're engaging in more military activities. We certainly saw an uptick after Speaker Pelosi's visit while I was in Japan down there. And so again, they're practicing, right?
And just to speak to Speaker Pelosi's visit, a lot of times we think about the speaker's visit to Taiwan as being, coming from a Western perspective, as being quite distant from Japan. But you were there, but there are these seas in between. And but could you characterize for us like how close and how proximal the furthest outreaches of Japan and Taiwan are, and how significant that was for U.S. allies and partners?
It was very significant, especially because I was in Japan at that time. And I will tell you that China responded with the most aggressive exercises that we've seen to date. They launched some missiles in the area that landed pretty close to Taiwan and Japan. And again, these were all exercises. And so clearly they were not pleased by the speaker's visit. And again, from China's perspective, right, this is a wayward state, and a high-ranking U.S. official was visiting this wayward state. And so that was our experience. I mean, we were concerned because it was pretty aggressive, and it's not anything that we had seen in the past.
Yeah, it's worth noting that is a perfect illustration of this kind of ratcheting effect that we're describing. People have described the pattern of People's Liberation Army, PLA, practice subsequent to that Pelosi visit as a new normal. And this is what I mean about these kind of periodized opportunities to unveil a new set of capabilities and to exercise some greater measure of control. And I think we should expect to see exercises again be the vehicle for some of these ratcheting effects of establishing new normal patterns of behavior. There will be an inauguration in May. They've done demonstrative things with missiles and aircraft in the past around Taiwanese elections. There was somewhat of a crisis associated with it in 1996. And if you'll indulge me, maybe it's worth talking about that crisis for a moment, which is a really kind of seminal moment in China's understanding of what it was up against in the Western Pacific with respect to Taiwan. They launched, as I said, these kind of demonstrative, mostly missile exercises, bracketing the island and sort of showing that they had certain capabilities and willingness to use them in this theater. And the United States response was to deploy two carrier strike groups. I think they called them battle groups at the time, or whatever they used to be called, to the region, and immediately, effectively establishing sea and air control. Chinese capabilities at that stage had been sort of delayed in the process of their reforms. The military had not been a high priority, but we see subsequent to that a really concerted set of efforts on this Taiwan problem set, and particularly on the capabilities, not so much for an invasion, it's worth noting, but to generate overwhelming missile capability and capacity, depth of magazine, a problem that we're seeing in a lot of the conflicts raging on around the world today, that they've systematically invested in since that time. And again, the fact of Taiwanese elections, of course, is a great offense to the Chinese sense of what is going on in this situation. They claim sovereignty over Taiwan, of course. And so these sorts of episodes of an inauguration or an election tend to be convenient reasons for China to show us something new. So keep your eyes open in May when they do the inauguration. I don't have the date offhand.
All right, so we've been talking a lot about creeping forward and ratcheting up, but as one of the things that we discussed earlier was that all of us are very hopeful that there's a way to turn down the temperature and to reduce the likelihood of conflict between Taiwan and China because of its really significant global implications for the U.S. as well as partners in the region and beyond. So, based upon your research, Isaac, and what you have seen, Dr. Kardon, what you have seen, Commander Zimmerman, what are some ideas, some policy suggestions, or even just some practical innovations that you think might allow us to move in that direction? If it's possible, and
so,
hope that
again, this is Delicia Zimmerman, not the United States Navy. I know I've been harping a lot about strategic ambiguity, but I'm going to go back to that. I think if we made some statements, and I think we have recently, about saying, hey, we do not support Taiwan breaking away unilaterally. And that's the key, right? We don't want a unilateral change in the status quo from either party. And so I think that would go a long way, hopefully. But as much as we can get back to that policy, that would probably be better for everyone. But outside of that, that's way above my pay grade.
Let me offer one, I think, practical, realistic, constructive suggestion. And it doesn't require that China do anything. It requires that the U.S. Senate ratify the law of the sea, advise and consent on it. And the reason I say that is one of the reasons that China has been able to sustain this ongoing campaign. I would say, the intensity of it really picked up in the 90s and into the 2000s. It's not a Xi Jinping phenomenon, but they've gained momentum on the fact that the United States looks bad in enforcing the U.S. interpretation of the law of the sea, but refusing to accept the obligations that come with having ratified the treaty. Most pointedly, in 2013, the Philippines brought the PRC to an arbitration under the law of the sea, and the PRC disregarded it entirely, viewed it as illegitimate. The United States supported it, and yet, because we're not a party to the law of the sea, there is no mechanism, there is no jurisdiction, there's no standing for any court to bring any arbitration against us. And I actually think, this may be slightly counterintuitive, but I think the United States joining the law of the sea, being taken to court by, say, Canada or anybody else who's got a maritime dispute with the U.S., because there are, or someone who objects to our excessive claims, our practice of freedom of navigation against excessive claims. There are any number of different things that you could imagine being brought against the United States. But going through that legal process, accepting the results of it, would do much more to reinforce the stability and robustness of international law and make it more difficult for China to change it, to manipulate it, and make the countries in the region somewhat less cynical about what the nature of the United States' commitment is to the rules-based order. If I can, just a minor second suggestion, thinking about those states in the region, the United States is focused almost single-mindedly on freedom of navigation issues, in particular for military vessels and aircraft. And I think that is relevant and important, and it is a national interest. But that's pretty distant from the national interests of Vietnam and the Philippines, and arguably anybody else in that region, because none of them are operating naval and air forces that are capable, have the capacity, or have the interest, ultimately, in upholding those norms. When we talk about that, it tees up China to say it's the United States that's militarizing this region. If, on the other hand, the United States were more focused on the resource claims in the exclusive economic zones of the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia and Brunei and Japan and South Korea and North Korea, I should mention there's no maritime boundary between anyone. If we were a little bit more systematic in saying, we're interested in upholding your rights under the law of the sea. You have an exclusive economic zone. That's exclusive economic rights to fish, develop oil and gas, do scientific research, etc. So those are two hopefully modest and constructive suggestions that might make it harder for China to pursue its goals and also de-escalate some of the tension.
Actually, if I can comment.
Please.
100% agree with Dr. Kardon. So as the United States Navy, we do a lot of freedom of navigation operations. And so one of the complaints that we receive from China, right, is you're not a member of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. What are you guys doing out there, right? You're dangerous. You're violating our sovereignty. You're illegally entering our waters. And so by signing or ratifying the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, right, that would establish our moral imperative to be able to do that, and our moral standing to be able to do those operations. I also agree that relying solely on the U.S. Navy in that area is probably the wrong strategy. And so there are a lot of tools in our toolkit. And one of the things that I would argue is, there's a lot of talk going on about how the United States Navy is smaller than the PRC's Navy, and how we need to build more ships. This is, again, Delicia Zimmerman. I would say, let's build more Coast Guard cutters, not U.S. naval warships. And the reason why is because of the illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. And most of our allies and partners in the area would rather us help them with that than, us steaming through the South China Sea. And I would agree that it is in our interests that we got more involved in IUU fishing, because again, this illegal fishing that's going on impacts us all. Half of the world relies upon fish for their primary needs of protein. And China is the #1 producer of fish. And the reason why they're able to do that is because they engage in some, let's say, not so honest business practices, right? So they subsidize their fishing fleets. The New Yorker and the New York Times recently published articles about the extensive use of debt bondage for the fishermen that are on board these ships. I mean, essentially, all the abuses that occur on board these ships allow them to sell fish at an unreasonably low price, which hurts legal fishermen, right? And coastal nations that rely upon fishing for their economic stability. So if we're gonna, if we were gonna do something, that's what I would say. I'm gonna give the Coast Guard a plug. They need more cutters, because we've entered into a lot of bilateral agreements with a lot of these coastal countries to be able to help them enforce their fishing rights in those areas. It's just we don't have enough Coast Guard cutters to help out.
This is really helpful, and I'm grateful to both of you for kind of thinking creatively about these issues, because so often when we're having these discussions about China and Taiwan, it ends up just escalating, kind of doing exactly what we were trying not to do, which is just talking about these conflicts as opposed to talking about ways to mitigate them and to hopefully increase stability in the region. So now getting back to Isaac's terrific book, which you should all check out at the end of the event. What was most surprising for you when you were doing your research? When you were going through it, you were like, you know what, I would not have expected this to happen or to see this?
So I did field work for this book as a doctoral candidate, and I had an appointment as a visiting scholar at a Chinese state think tank in Hainan. Hainan is an island in the South China Sea. It's not so far from Hong Kong, southwest of Hong Kong, and it is a place of extraordinary interest in South China Sea issues by virtue of its geography, and this was a think tank literally called the National Institute for South China Sea Studies. And so I was there in a place where there's more specialized knowledge and interest about these issues than just about anywhere in China, and I showed up as a wide-eyed graduate student with a bunch of specific questions that I was trying to answer, and I was especially focused on these freedom of navigation issues because that's what you've heard the most about in the United States. It seemed to activate the most significant U.S. interests, and what I really wanted to do was dig into, when the Chinese say you're violating our sovereignty by operating aircraft or naval vessels in the exclusive economic zone. I wanted to know what's the reasoning behind that in China? Where in Chinese legislation and regulations, administrative rules, departmental rules, policies, any kind of normative document, they call them, where they specify what it is that's illegal about U.S. freedom of navigation exercises, or the exercise of rights under international law to fly, sail, and operate in these spaces. And I was surprised to discover that it actually just doesn't exist. The way that the law and regulation are crafted there, I gave you an illustration of how the Supreme People's Court speaks about it. That's quite a typical way of avoiding some type of contradiction, avoiding attaching a very precise and determinate set of Chinese claims to their policy. It allows this type of flexibility, this kind of discretion. And what you see in practice, so I was looking not just at the documents, but also at the behavior, is that there's an inconsistent and non-uniform way for China to oppose these freedom of navigation operations. There's no rhyme or reason from a legal standpoint. There's no systematic reason why they oppose one thing or another. I'll give you an example. And this doesn't involve the United States, so we can, kind of control for some of that problem here. In 2019, the PLA Navy celebrated its 70th anniversary, and they held a big party in Qingdao, northeast China, and they invited a lot of foreign navies to come for, one of these kind of military diplomacy events. Among the invitees are the French and the Indians. They both sailed frigates through the Taiwan Strait on the same track, and the French frigate was denied Its invitation was rescinded because of political determination made in Beijing. France had decided they were going to start actually deploying that frigate to the Western Pacific. Maybe it was not that particular vessel, but French policy had offended Beijing in some fundamental way. And therefore, they said what they did was illegal and what the Indians did was not, even though they were doing exactly the same thing in the exact same place in close sequence with one another. And that's an anecdotal illustration of a more systematic property of how China does this, which is they've drawn a very wide circle. You've seen it in the 9-dash line, but they've also drawn a very wide scope just in general about their discretion to interpret what the law of the sea means in individual cases. And they resist drafting their laws and rules and regulations in ways that are going to constrain them. It creates this type of political flexibility, and that's very frustrating for U.S. lawyers. I can see Commander Zimmerman kind of shaking her head. You would fail your students for something, for drafting draft legislation in that form. But this is the way that the administration of law in China functions, and it's an externalization of it. It's quite frustrating from a U.S. legal standpoint, but it is the norm in China. And I think once you start to recognize how law functions, both within China as well as in the areas that it claims to be within China. It's worth noting, we're talking all about Chinese domestic law in some fundamental way. We're saying this is our jurisdiction, this is the way that we interpret under our domestic law. So anyway, I found it quite surprising, and I didn't expect that exactly. I kind of thought I didn't think that there was necessarily going to be a eureka moment where I found the one document, but I thought that there was going to be some process whereby I was able to interpolate from some more or less specific things as to what's the nature of the jurisdiction that China claims, such that military navigation is not permitted, but some other types of navigation are. It ain't there, I'm sorry to say. So that was a bit of a surprise to me.
That's a surprise to me as well. So I appreciate you sharing that story. I also spent some time on Hainan, but I did not have such a serious and worthy intention while I was there. It was more eating tropical fruit and going to the beach. Which was very nice. Yeah.
I did a little of that.
Yeah. But I do want to note that we are very eager to bring in audience questions. So there should be cards and pencils next to you, and our team will collect those if you would like to share them. And while that is happening, I did want to ask you both one additional moderator question, which is, when you see these issues, what do you think the media gets wrong?
So,
or most of the media, like maybe they're like, not to besmirch all journalists, but.
So I will say this, I think what the public really doesn't know about U.S. naval operations in the Pacific generally, the way China categorizes whenever we do a freedom of navigation operation, what they'll say is, again, we're these interlopers, we're coming from the United States and, we're in their waters illegally, we're dangerous. But what really gets me is the interloper part, because I think what a lot of people and probably a lot of Americans don't realize is we've been in that area of operations for over 200 years. So what a lot of people don't understand is that our first official squadron in that AOR was the Far East Squadron, and it was established in 1835. But before then, we were operating. And the reason why is what a lot of people don't understand is that one of our primary missions for the United States Navy is promoting prosperity. If you go to Title 10, U.S. Code 8062, that is one of the first things that we are tasked with, is promoting prosperity. If people remember way back when, after the Revolutionary War, the Navy was disbanded. We were brought back because of piracy. And so one of our primary missions is to protect trade. And so we've been having trade with China, with Japan for a really, really long time. And as long as we've had merchants there, you have had the United States Navy there. And so I think what a lot of times people don't understand is, yes, we are supposed to project combat power in wartime, but our primary purpose for being is really to protect trade, and we're doing that right now, trying to in the Red Sea. And so I think that's one of the things that people forget about. And like I said, I take offense to being called an interloper because we've been there forever. And we also have our interests there, right? So Guam, the Northern Marianas, we have a lot of territories and possessions out there. We have a lot of unmanned islands as well out in the Pacific. And so we have an interest there because trade is there. And so that's my little diatribe for a little bit, but just know it's not like one day we woke up in 2012 and we're like, you know what? Let's go to the South China Sea and annoy the Chinese. You know what? That's going to be fun. We've been there because we have economic interests in that area.
Dr. Kardon?
So there are a lot to choose from. Sorry to say, it is a.
Well, pick your favorite for now.
That's
We've got a lot of great questions coming.
It's a complex. The law of the sea is extremely complex. The disputes are extremely complex. It's very easy to misstate and misinterpret it. So I'd say read everything with a grain of salt. But there is one very narrow thing that I think is illustrative of a larger problem. As I mentioned, the Philippines brought an arbitration against China in 2013. And because the registry for that arbitration was the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, it's been reported across the board around the world as being a PCA arbitration, or Permanent Court of Arbitration arbitration. That's why you say the acronym. And the reality is, it's an UNCLOS. It's a UN Convention on the Law of the Sea arbitration. That's the basis for the Philippines standing in the case. That's the basis for the court to have jurisdiction. And what this misses is not just that, it's not that technical detail, but it's about what's China's relationship to international law. If our image in our mind is they just don't care about it at all and they're doing everything they can to undermine it, we're missing the very deliberate and systematic efforts to work with the law to change it in ways that give China advantages, and missing the fact that this is all happening within the law of the sea, and that China has ratified the law of the sea, and that it has an obligation, whether it likes it or not, that an arbitration is final and binding. If you want to be in the treaty, that's what you've agreed to in advance. And by missing that, I would say, really fundamental part of the story. It's not just the Philippines coming up with some outrageous kind of PR stunt and shopping it around to courts that might want to pick it up. It's that China, in full exercise of its own sovereignty, consented to this arbitration, in effect. That's what you did when you signed the treaty, and that's one of the reasons that the United States won't do it. And so I think there's this really instructive little kernel in there that would allow this issue to not be so bewildering and confusing, and to not have the introduction of the U.S. not being in the law of the sea be this big dramatic interruption and kind of confuse everyone. I think you need to think about the law of the sea, and that's why I wrote a book about it.
Well, thank you. Well, we have a lot of terrific questions from our audience, but one from Mark Metcalf, McIntyre School, is there has been a lot in the PRC media in recent days about actions taken by the Philippines to push back against PRC South China Sea claims. Based on these articles, it seems like the PRC is taken aback by Filipino actions. Do you have any thoughts regarding the likely trajectory of these interactions?
So what I was reading also is the Philippines is actually thinking about turning one of those rocks into an island themselves. And so now we're looking at potentially, a lot of island building in this area. Yeah, I think China is surprised that the Philippines is taking such an aggressive stance. But you also have to remember that shortly after the PCA decision was rendered, UNCLOS, that's right. Sorry, the UNCLOS arbitration decision was rendered. There was a change in the administration, right? And so it kind of got pushed to the side. And so the Philippines didn't aggressively enforce that. Plus, honestly, comparatively speaking, they don't have the means to aggressively push back on China. But what we're seeing today is that the United States and Japan, we're conducting a training exercise in the West Philippine Sea with 2 aircraft carriers and a lot of firepower. So we're doing what the Philippines can't do for themselves. But I mean, I'm going to hand it to their fishermen. They're trying to go toe to toe with the Chinese Coast Guard. There was one incident where they went and cut a net down that the PRC had, or the PLAN had put up. So, I mean, they're doing what they can within the means that they have.
Yeah, I think just adding on to that, the Philippines has been willing to accept a lot more risk over the last couple months. They're trying to resupply this old, actually, U.S. Navy vessel that was given to the Philippines that's now grounded on a reef there. And when they started to try to resupply it with building materials, because it's been there for 25 years and is disintegrating, and it's actually manned by a small number of Marines who live a pretty austere life on a rusting hulk in the middle of the South China Sea. This is hot and humid and it's prone to storms. At any rate, the Philippines elected to take a page out of China's book, in a sense. And I think this is sort of the upshot of China having pursued this strategy for so long, is that they don't give you a big flat surface to target. They're not using naval vessels to kinetically, forcefully sink their rival claimants' vessels or even seize their islands, except for a couple notable periodic incidents where they have ratcheted up their control of actual territory. And so the Philippines is looking and they're saying, okay, if we can accept that China is going to turn fire hoses on us, we can just kind of try and run the gauntlet here. They've showed us that they're not necessarily willing to escalate to use of lethal force, and they're just going for it. And the Vietnamese are doing similar things. People may have heard of the Chinese Maritime Militia. These are a bunch of notionally fishing vessels that also can be deputized by the People's Liberation Army. Guess what? Vietnam's got one too. Guess what? Vietnam's building up is dredging up coral and building out its islands. They're thinking about reinforcing their garrisons on them. And so I think the Philippines is yet another illustration of, this is not just a linear process. The other states, the regional states who are so often ignored in this discussion, get a vote, and China's actually showing them a set of tactics, techniques, and procedures you could think of that are actually low escalatory, introduce some risk, but are very difficult to counter unless you're willing to be the one to pull the trigger. And I think they're calling China's bluff on just how much force they're willing to use. Now, this is problematic from the standpoint of an alliance relationship. We don't want the Philippines taking risks on the American account. And I think this is a very delicate diplomatic and strategic problem to deal with. And it's not so dissimilar from the situation with Taiwan. And it's a familiar dynamic from alliances that I think, we're seeing this in the context of the Philippines now. I think it's troubling because it's teeing China up to try and test what's the threshold of the U.S. commitment to the Philippines under its mutual defense treaty. And yet, if this is calibrated properly, they're doing things that are not so provocative that China is going to be willing to use force to interdict them. And I think so far they seem to be skating by on that. I wouldn't say I feel totally sanguine about where this is headed, because it's gotten more intense over time, and there's a lot loaded up in this little rusting hulk now in terms of sort of the face and reputation and status of U.S. treaty relationships and of China's ability to control what it views as its own territory and its own maritime space.
So in case you guys were just concerned about the Taiwan Straits, now you have another whole part of that region to be worried about. But thanks to the excellent question from Professor Mike Heff. So another question, which I think speaks to some of the things that have come up so far, can both of you speak more to the creeping control regarding shipping ports, fisheries, etc., fishing vessels, and how it is being challenged and exposed by U.S. and global communities, if it is.
So that actually gets something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. So I used to be assigned to U.S. Southern Command. And so our responsibility was Central and South America. And what people are not, we tend to look at the South China Sea and focus on Taiwan, but China is everywhere. And they're particularly aggressive in Central and South America. When we talk about ports, right, they're building a ginormous port in Peru. Their Chinese companies now operate both ends of the Panama Canal. They're building on Margarita Island, which is on the Atlantic side of the Panama Canal. And so this creeping, right, is not just occurring out in the South China Sea. It's getting all the media because we have the Philippines aggressively defending their fishing rights. What we're not paying attention to, and I would say as Americans, we probably should pay a little bit more attention to, is what's going on in the Western Hemisphere, right? This is our neighborhood. And yeah, it's concerning, like what, you know, 60% of U.S. trade goes through the Panama Canal. Only 20% of Chinese trade goes through the Panama Canal. So why do they need to control it? And so these are questions that we probably need to be asking as, you know, Americans, because we're all Americans, right? So that creeping control. With respect to the fisheries, I mean, again, they have these paramilitary militias, and they're the ones that are doing the vast majority of the work in the South China Sea by establishing presence, right? They're not using the Coast Guard a little bit, but they're not really using their Navy to enforce these presence operations. They're really using these militias. And, you know, they're fishing by day, doing, you know, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance at night. And so, yeah, we're seeing a creep. But what we're also seeing is that these coastal nations are starting to wake up and they're starting to push back, which is unusual. And this is something that's new.
Well, if you get me started talking about ports, you might need to drag me out of here because
in one and a half
minutes.
And or if you could just tell us your favorite part about your book, that would be the other option in 1.5 minutes.
Let me say that I've written a lot on Chinese investments and operations of ports, and a more accessible version of it is in Foreign Affairs last year. You're welcome to take a look, but this is certainly another kind of creeping phenomenon. My favorite part of the book.
Yeah. In 1 minute. Finish it. Take us home.
So that's a good question. I think that my favorite part of it is the very end, and I think it'll be yours too, because what I'm trying to do in most of the book is and I shouldn't do this because I want to sell books, but it's a very academic exercise. I'm looking at specific rules. I'm trying to apply a uniform standard of how I'm analyzing Chinese practice. And practice means their law as well as their operational behavior. And this is extremely interesting if you're interested in the subject, so I certainly would encourage you to buy it. But the end is where I try, and instead of having this kind of bottom-up view, this idea that order is constituted by a lot of rules, it's not entirely satisfying theoretically. It's just it's something that you do to get an angle or some leverage on this question. But what I try and do at the end is say, well, so what, right? Yeah. It's like, what's the upshot of having rules that are changed significantly or slightly or not at all, which is the findings are actually quite mixed when you look at the individual rules. And that actually requires a lot more creativity. It requires synthesizing some of the ideas and thinking through what sort of an order we might be observing in the offing. And my conclusion, and I really didn't conclude it until I'd written the book and had gone through the exercise, is that what we see is much more of a regional order. If I could have added a word to the title, it would have been China's Law of the Sea, the New Rules of, maybe 2 words, Maritime Order in Asia. And that's because China is very, very focused on waters under its jurisdiction and is actually somewhat indifferent to the rules and the law elsewhere. And this feels problematic for American audiences and Western audiences who have a sort of universalizing sense of what international law is. If it's not applicable everywhere, it's not the law in some fundamental way. That's the logic of the system, whereas from China's perspective, the logic revolves around their sovereignty and the scope of authority that their sovereignty grants them. And so they, as we talked about at lunch, they operate their naval and aircraft in American exclusive economic zones in exactly the ways that we do in theirs. And there actually is no inconsistency in them doing that from my standpoint. And I know it sounds difficult to understand, but the United States does not restrict military navigation in our exclusive economic zone, nor do most states, although there are some. It's not restricted in the Law of the Sea Treaty in terms of its black letters. So I think thinking about it in a regional and a geographic sense is something that I didn't get to by doing this kind of composition of all the individual things. But when you think about where is there genuinely change, it's in the region, and it's not because China's succeeded in changing many rules. Au contraire, actually, it's very hard for them to change any rules because they have disputes over all of them with neighbors who haven't acquiesced to it in most cases. So they may be a persistent objector to the law from a doctrinal standpoint. But rather, they've made the law less important in East Asia. That's the real upshot. China's not making the rules, it's making the rules less effective. And you don't need to look further than the arbitration for a really keen example of this. By completely dismissing it, China has made other arbitrations somewhat less legitimate, somewhat less likely to be honored in the breach, maybe even somewhat less likely to be brought. And that's one of many illustrations I could offer you to. Basically, it's not that they've changed the rules so much as they've introduced a new rising power to support their creeping jurisdiction.
Well, thank you so much, Isaac, and thank you so much, Commander Zimmerman, and thank you so much, Dr. Kardon, for a terrific talk. I've really enjoyed learning from you. Let's give them a big round of applause. And many thanks to our